There's a place where the ocean doesn't just carry water, it carries memory. Screams buried in the salt, names lost to the wind. This was once called the Slave Coast, stretching from Ghana to Nigeria, Benin to Togo. This coastline was a living artery in the machinery of the transatlantic slave trade, a place where kings struck deals, where empires profited, and where millions began a nightmare that would rewrite the black world forever. But beyond the colonial textbooks and sanitized history lies a truth deeper than any dungeon, a truth carved into the walls of Elmina, whispered in the groves of Ouidah, and echoing through the bloodlines of the African diaspora. It's time we remember. Before the chains, before the ships, there was civilization. Thriving kingdoms along this coast, the Ashanti, the Dahomey, the Yoruba, the Fan. They were not passive victims of history. They were warriors, traders, diplomats with their own gods, their own gold, their own greatness. The so-called Slave Coast was not just a loading dock. It was a battleground for ideology, identity, and power. Trade was already ancient here. Kola nuts, spices, gold, knowledge, Islam and Christianity filtered in slowly through these ports. But everything would change when Europe arrived, not to trade but to conquer.
Key historical points. The meaning of Slave Coast, named by Europeans due to its importance in human trafficking. Kingdoms involved: Dahomey, Benin, Nigeria, Ashanti, Ghana, and coastal Ewe and Gardangbi peoples. Early trade networks between African nations and Mediterranean Arab traders before European contact. The complexity of power, African agency in negotiating, resisting, and sometimes profiting from trade with Europeans.
We've been taught that Africa was sold out by its own people, but the truth is layered, brutal, and inconvenient to those who benefit from a simple narrative. Because for every king who struck a deal, there were elders who resisted. For every trader who colluded, there were mothers who fought. And for every captive taken, there were hundreds more who never made it to the shore. This isn't a story of shame. It's a story of survival. They came dressed in silk, holding crosses in one hand and chains in the other. The Portuguese were the first to land, but behind them came the Dutch, the British, the French, and they all wanted one thing: African flesh. They called it commerce, but it was conquest by another name. In the 15th century, when Portuguese traders docked along the Gulf of Guinea, they were not met by savages, they were met by kings. But with every handshake came a knife in the back. What began as trade in gold and ivory soon mutated. The beast had tasted blood, and it wanted more. The Europeans brought mirrors, muskets, liquor, and built castles, not to protect Africans but to trap them.
Historical locations introduced. Elmina Castle, Ghana, built by the Portuguese in 1482. Africa's first permanent European structure. Ouidah, Benin, one of the largest slave export ports, controlled by the Kingdom of Dahomey. Badagry, Nigeria, coastal port that funneled thousands of slaves through the point of no return.
In Elmina, men were packed like cattle into dark, airless dungeons. The smell of fear baked into stone. Women were raped, flogged, humiliated, all while priests said prayers above their heads. These castles weren't just prisons, they were symbols. Europe didn't just steal people, it built monuments to that theft. The European empires turned the coast into a factory. Human lives in, profit out? Guns were exchanged for bodies. The more captives a kingdom could sell, the more weapons it got. And so, some African rulers, hungry for power or desperate for survival, played the game. But don't be mistaken, this wasn't a fair deal. It was a system rigged from the start where Africans fought wars with European guns. To capture other Africans? To be sold to European ships to fuel European empires.
Truth bombs. Portugal began exporting enslaved Africans as early as 1444. By the 1600s, over 12 European forts lined the Gold Coast alone. The door of no return became a sacred wound, symbolizing lives erased from the continent.
They called it trade, but it was theft dressed in treaties. They called it civilization, but it was genocide wrapped in religion. And while the African coast bled, Europe built wealth beyond imagination. Cotton in America, sugar in the Caribbean, empires that stood on black bones. The coast was no longer just a shoreline. It was a wound, a highway of horror, a memory scarred into the soul of a people. They want you to believe we went quietly, that we submitted, that we accepted chains like cattle. But history, real history, tells a different story. One of rebellion, one of fire, one of people who refused to kneel. Before the first slave ship ever docked, African kingdoms had power. They had structure, they had armies, and they fought. The Kingdom of Congo, under King Garcia II, resisted Portuguese domination for decades. The Ashanti Confederacy built a war machine feared by British invaders. And the Dahomey Amazons, they didn't just fight, they hunted slavers.
Notable resistance movements: Queen Mzinga of Ndongo in Matomba, Angola, a strategist, warrior, and negotiator. Mzinga led 30 years of resistance against the Portuguese in the 1600s. She walked into a room where no seat was offered, so she made a servant kneel and sat on his back. That's how Africa stood in the face of empire. The Dahomey Amazons, Benin, elite female fighters who launched deadly raids against enemies, including slave outposts. These weren't sidekicks. These were lionesses trained for war and feared across the region. The Maroons of Jamaica, Brazil, and Suriname enslaved Africans who escaped and built fortified communities that defied recapture. They turned mountains into freedom zones, jungle into fortresses. They fought for every inch of liberty.
Iconic resistance events. Battle of Adwa, Ethiopia. Though not on the slave coast, Ethiopia's victory over Italy in 1896 became a Pan-African symbol of resistance.
The slave revolt in Bahia, 1835. Brazil. A Muslim-led uprising by enslaved Africans, many of whom were Yoruba and Hausa. They prayed, they plotted, and they nearly overthrew the entire system in one night.
Resistance wasn't rare, it was everywhere. But colonial historians erased it, because rebellion ruins the lie of African passivity. There were rebellions on the ships, rebellions in the dungeons, rebellions in the fields. Everywhere the whip cracked, there was also a fist clenched. Weapons weren't just iron and fire, they were spirit. In Haiti, it was voodoo that sparked the only successful slave revolt in history. In Bahia, it was the Quran that guided warriors into battle. Across West Africa, ancestral spirits were called on for strength. European missionaries thought they were saving souls. But many Africans knew the truth. Their gods hadn't abandoned them. They were sharpening them.
Truth bombs. Up to 1 in 10 slave ships experienced organized rebellions. Many African empires lost their rulers, armies, and cities fighting the transatlantic trade. Spiritual traditions were outlawed because they inspired unity and rebellion.
They broke our chains, but not our spirit. They buried the stories of warriors, queens, and prophets, but history remembers. Africa did not go quietly into the night. We screamed, we bled, we fought, and we survived. They tried to erase us, scatter us, break the line between who we were and who we became. But look closely, and you'll see, the line never broke. It just shifted, it bent, and it grew. Millions were taken, but they didn't vanish, they transformed. Where the slave coast echo survives. Brazil, Bahia, the largest African population outside of Africa. Yoruba culture, Candomblé spirituality, and resistance traditions are alive in carnival, cuisine, and language. Haiti, birthplace of the only successful slave revolt. Badou, Creole language, and the rhythm of the gem all trace back to West Africa, Jamaica, and the Caribbean. Maroon strongholds. Reggae with African heartbeat. Patois with roots in Chui and Ga. Southern USA, New Orleans, Georgia, the Carolinas. Gullah Geechee culture preserves. Direct links to Sierra Leonean and Ghanaian. Traditions, storytelling. Foodways, even language. Suriname and French Guiana, descendants of runaway Africans who never returned to slavery, maintained their tribal structures, leadership, and spirituality in jungle sanctuaries. In the face of chains, we created culture. In the depths of despair, we carved joy. And in the silence they forced, we sang. Examples. Capoeira, a martial art disguised as dance by enslaved Brazilians. Voodoo and Candomblé, spiritual rebellions that connected gods from Dahomey, Yoruba, and Congo lands. Black churches, hubs of resistance and identity in the Americas, fusing African rhythms with biblical stories. Food, okra from Igbo, rice from Senegal, black-eyed peas, fufu, soul food is survival food. From the ashes rose giants. The bloodline of the slave coast birthed world changers. Harriet Tubman, great-granddaughter of West Africans who resisted. W.E.B. Du Bois, father of Pan-African thought, buried in Ghana. Marcus Garvey, visionary from Jamaica who reconnected black minds with Africa. Thomas Sankara, West African leader who called for dignity and self-reliance. Malcolm X, Muslim, revolutionary whose lineage carried the fire of enslaved West Africans. Each one, a flicker from the fire they couldn't extinguish. Now the descendants are returning. Year of Return Ghana, 2019. Welcomed African Americans and the diaspora to retrace their roots. Millions now tracing ancestry back to the slave coast, Yoruba, Akan, Fulani. We are finding our way back not just to a land, but to a legacy.
True bombs. Over 70% of African Americans have ancestry from the Slave Coast region. Many African spiritual practices survived colonial bans through music, dance, and hidden symbols. Pan-Africanism was born from the Slave Coast's pain and became its hope.
The story didn't end with chains. It began again, in drum beats, in tongues, in prayers whispered under breath. From the slave coast came a diaspora that sang, fought, built, and endured. And now, it remembers. For centuries, the slave coast was remembered for chains and silence. But today, the silence is breaking. The memory is rising. The story is changing. Once, they were taken. Now, they return. Ghana's Year of Return 2019. Over 1 million people from the diaspora visited. Ghana connecting with their roots, receiving citizenship, and investing in heritage. Benin's Door of Return. Annual ceremonies that honor ancestors and reverse the symbolic exile of the enslaved. Nigeria's Yoruba festivals. Welcoming diasporans from Cuba, Brazil, the U.S., and Trinidad reconnecting through Orisha worship, drumming, and language revival. Reclaiming the slave coast means taking back the narrative. From the conqueror's quill to the griot's tongue, African historians like Professor Alabi Yai Benin and Toyin Falola Nigeria are writing the story from inside the continent. Black creators are now telling their own history, and millions are listening. Books like Born in Blackness, Howard French, and the 1619 Project have reignited global curiosity about African origins. Griot schools and Afrocentric education models are rising in Ghana, Senegal, and the U.S. We are no longer subjects of history. We are the authors. The Slave Coast is not just reclaiming memory, it's reclaiming power. Sites like Elmina Castle, the Ouidah Museum, and the slave route in Togo now attract global visitors. Fashion brands, ancestral travel agencies, DNA testing companies, and wellness retreats are building around the legacy of the Slave Coast. African Americans, Caribbeans, and Afro-Brazilians are now buying land, building schools, and funding local businesses in places like Cape Coast, Katana, and Accra. What was once taken, land, wealth, pride, is being slowly returned. Reclaiming the Slave Coast also means confronting the systems that still profit from erasure. Colonial statues are falling. Reparations campaigns are gaining steam in the UK, US, and Caribbean. Artifacts stolen from the Slave Coast, like the Benin bronzes, are being demanded back by African nations. Language and religion once banned are now being taught to the next generation. This is not nostalgia, it's a cultural revolution. The Slave Coast teaches us one thing: even when they steal your body, they can't own your soul. Even when they sell your name, your story remains. Spirituality survived, culture adapted, truth endured, resistance never stopped. This coast was never just about slavery, it was about survival, genius, power, memory, and now it's about return, restoration, revolution. We are the sons and daughters of the Slave Coast, and we're still here. The coast they tried to bury is rising, and the world is finally watching. Subscribe,